Welcome back to 6 Degrees of Ukraine. In part 1, we trace Zelensky's rise from comedian to wartime leader. Now, in part 2, we follow the story into more uncomfortable territory, the shifting ground under his feet, and what happens when the West's golden boy becomes a political liability. This is where Zelensky's story stops being about heroism and starts being about survival. The first cracks, the counteroffensive that wasn't. By 2023, Ukraine was running on borrowed time and borrowed cash. Zelenskyy had promised a sweeping counteroffensive that would break Russian lines and retake lost ground. It didn't happen. Instead, Ukraine bled men, burned through Western weapons, and barely moved the front line. Soldiers were exhausted, recruitment slowed, and behind the scenes, Ukrainian commanders grew frustrated with the president they saw as obsessed with optics over strategy. The cracks between military brass and Zelensky's inner circle widened, but nobody talked about it publicly, not yet. Western patience wears thin. In Western capitals, Zelensky's once stirring speeches started landing differently. The man who had once captivated parliaments now sounded to some like a demanding house guest overstaying his welcome. The message from Washington and Berlin shifted. We support Ukraine, but there are limits. Behind closed doors, Western leaders started talking about off-ramps, code for negotiated settlements, territorial compromises, and ways to end the war without total Ukrainian victory. That talk enraged Zelenskyy, who built his entire wartime image around defiance, not compromise. Enter Trump. The script flips. Then came the 2024 U.S. elections, and everything changed. Trump's return to the White House wasn't just a shift, it was an earthquake. Trump didn't just question aid to Ukraine, he questioned Zelenskyy himself. The man who had been Churchill in Biden's eyes was now a bad investment in Trump's. Trump openly courted Putin, held calls without notifying Kyiv, and framed Ukraine as a burden, not a cause. Suddenly, Zelenskyy wasn't just fighting Russia, he was fighting to stay relevant in Washington. Zelensky's gamble, flatter and fight. Faced with this new reality, Zelenskyy tried a two-pronged approach. Publicly, he flattered Trump, calling him a strong leader who could scare Putin into backing down. Privately, he panicked. Zelenskyy leaned hard into Europe, calling for an EU army and demanding NATO-style guarantees from Brussels. A long shot at best, but a signal that Ukraine would look elsewhere if Washington walked away. The Munich moment exposed him alone. By early 2025, the cracks turned into chasms. At the Munich Security Conference, Zelenskyy openly admitted he didn't know who would represent Ukraine at upcoming peace talks because nobody had told him. The United States, Ukraine's supposed ally, was negotiating over Ukraine's future without Ukraine in the room. That moment, caught on video, was a gut punch. The man once cast as Churchill was now closer to a pawn, a chess piece moved by powers far bigger than his own. Trump's price tag, payback time. Then came the final insult, a demand from Trump's Treasury Department. Ukraine, they said, should repay U.S. aid, possibly through natural resource concessions. To Trump, Ukraine was no longer a brave ally. It was a bad business deal that needed renegotiating. To Zelenskyy, it was humiliation piled on top of betrayal. The internal reckoning. Meanwhile, back in Ukraine, Zelensky's domestic standing was eroding. Wartime unity masked growing resentment over corruption scandals, uneven military mobilization, and accusations that political rivals were being sidelined under martial law. If peace talks happened, martial law will end, and with it, Zelensky's unchecked authority. Elections will return, and in those elections, Zelensky won't just face the ghosts of war, he'll face a public angry at the cost of survival and hungry for someone to blame. From Churchill to Mannerheim. Zelensky's story has always been about transformation. Now, he faced one final shift. From Churchill, the defiant hero, to Mannerheim, the Finnish leader who signed a bitter peace deal to save his country. Can Zelensky convince his people and himself that survival is victory? Or will the role that made him famous, the uncompromising war leader, be the very thing that destroys him when the war ends? Closing. In part 3, we'll look at the brewing internal struggles inside Ukraine, the emerging power players waiting in the wings, and the cold reality of what peace, if it comes, will actually mean for Ukraine and for Zelensky himself. This isn't just a story about a president, it's a story about the cost of leadership, the price of survival, and what happens when the applause stops. 6 Degrees of Ukraine, because no story stands alone.